The Wellington Fund lost nearly half its value at the start of its illustrious career in 1930. Nuts, huh? Would you have stuck with it? We're going to talk about that because this is a blog post I posted about a week and a half or so ago on the Heritage Wealth Planning blog. You can find it under the blog right there. So Heritage Wealth Planning, if you just go to the heritagewealthplanning.com, post a blog, and I had written this and I sent it as an email to the folks who are on my subscribe list. But I also post these on the blogs too. And actually, it's a really important piece, and I wanted to share it with you via video because there are some visuals in here. All right, so let's read it. Again, the Wellington Fund at the start of the Great Depression. The Wellington Fund lost nearly half its value at the start of its illustrious career. Would you have stuck with it? Well, I hope so, because if you had started your retirement with $100,000 at the beginning of 1930 and invested 80% in the Wellington and 20% in 10-year Treasury bonds, by the time 1960 rolled around, you'd have $112,000. Oh, and by the way, that's taking 5% of your portfolio out initially and adjusting it for inflation each year. You heard that right. That's a 5% distribution rate, and nowhere did you even come close to running out of the money. Did I mention this is in the Great Depression? This is the Great Depression where everyone's going bankrupt if you invested then. I find this to be incredible. There are a couple lessons to be learned here, which I'll share with you at the end of this email. So 80% Wellington Fund, 20% U.S. bonds. This can be one of the topics of my soon-to-be book, Retire with the Wellington Fund. The strategy was pretty simple too. Start with 80% Wellington, 20% U.S. bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds. After the first year, take $5,000 from whichever was up most. Adjust your distribution amount each year with inflation and take it from, again, the account that did the best. Rinse, wash, repeat. By 1941, when 1941 rolled around, the bond side of the portfolio had run out of money. It was exhausted. But no worries. The Wellington Fund took it from there. You may have heard that 1930s were quite bad for stocks. Here's the Wellington Fund year by year. Look at that. 1930 down 21%, 1931 down 26%, 1932 down 1.8, 1937 down 35.41. Notice the huge losses at the start of the decade, 26, 21, 26, and 2% respectively. Followed by some nice gains, 6, 7, 20, 35, 31, then kaboom, the buzzsaw of 1937. All in all, 1930s are like New York City. If you can survive it, you can survive anything. After the bonds were exhausted, what we say, 1941, the bonds were exhausted. Had nothing left for the bonds. The entirety of the distributions came solely from the Wellington Fund. However, because you were able to avoid the dreaded sequence of return risk in the beginning of your retirement by taking your annual distributions from the bonds instead of the Wellington Fund, we're not taking it from here, we're taking it from the bonds, you did just fine. The second column from the right here, shows the ending balance of, second column from the right. No, well, that's it right there. The second column from the right shows the ending balance of the Wellington Fund year by year. It's actually this fund. It should be the last column from the right. The last column on the right shows the ending balance minus the distributions. Right here. Okay, I don't know why I said the second column on the right. The last column on the right shows the ending balance minus the distribution amount. So here in 1941, the Wellington Fund had $61,000. All right, that's as low as it got. It didn't get anywhere near that after that. Remember, we started with $100,000. We took 5% a year, adjusted for inflation. We got hammered at the beginning of the 1930s, got hammered again in 1937. And at the end of 1941, we had 61,000 in there. So the said column right shows the ending balance of it shows the returns of the Wellington Fund. All right, so then by the end of 1959, you had $120,712. You started the Great Depression with $100,000, and 30 years later, you ended with more than $100,000, starting with a 5% distribution rate. It's insane to me. All right, so what's the issue here? Well, having the bonds or cash to offset the huge declines in your stocks to start retirement is huge. No two ways around this. You got to watch the sequence of return. I sent you an email recently that if you took 5% initially and adjusted for inflation each year solely from Wellington Fund, you would have run out of money by 1958. So if you would have done that, 5% a year adjusted for inflation, you would have ran out right here in 1958, whereas we still have more than what we put in, what we started with, because we had the 20% in bonds. So sequence of returns do matter. Inflation during the Great Depression, but you can't overlook the fact that what cost you $5,000 in 1930, by the end of the decade, only costed you $4,065. That deflation, i.e. the literal meaning of the Great Depression, the prices of goods are drop in value, where the depression, deflation, same thing. What cost you $5,000, 10 years later only cost $4,000. Turned out to be the saving grace for this portfolio sustainability. So we needed $5,000 in 1930. That was the inflation rate. By the end of 1940, we only needed $4,000 to have the same purchasing power. That's what happened here. So even though the Wellington Fund got hammered, our actual amount didn't get down as much because the deflation aspect offset the declines in the market. In fact, think about it like this. What I've always been preaching about retiree spending. Does it go down, up, or sideways? Well, as I stated in my new book, you can retire on Social Security. Retiree spending typically goes down, and a lot too. Similar to what happened in the 1930s, where the $5,000 in spending in 1930 adjusted for inflation was around $4,000 10 years later. This is actually a great chart to look at your real world spending patterns of the 1930s actually. I think, because that shows you when your spending goes down, this is a perfect reflection of it. Today, retiree spending declines not because deflationary pressure like the 1930s, but rather because people grow older and are less eager to do the same things they did previously. The reasoning for spending decreases is irrelevant, though. It doesn't matter why your spending decreases, be it deflation or you're just not consuming as much. The critical point is that when folks withdraw less as the years go by, their portfolio has more staying power. Regardless of why they're spending less, the fact that they're spending less, taking less from their portfolio inherently means they have more staying power. The more I think about this, the more surprised I am that the 1930s have been so neglected when it comes to retirement planning research. This decade has everything a researcher wants. Horrible negative returns to start the decade with a 2008-like year near the end. In fact, the 1930s look freakishly similar to the 2000s. Bond yields in the 2000s were much higher than they were in the 1930s, but so was inflation. And so it's basically a wash. And if you can survive the one decade, you're most likely to survive the other. So if you can survive the 1930s, you're certainly most likely to survive the aughts. But again, we look at the 1930s as a calamity of untold proportions for investors, and it's just not true. Now this realization has settled in for me. I know to use the 1930s as a proxy for a retiree with declining spending needs. It's a wonderful thing to behold. However, the inflationary monster is still lurking. He was born in 1966 and will devour many retirees over the next 16 years, from 1966 and 1982. He is my next challenge. If he can be slain without complexity just by using the Wellington Fund and 10-year treasuries, I might just have to call this my career. Got to go on top, no? All right, so I hope you like this. I tell you, this is a great piece I did. I mean, not to sweat myself here, but I'm a huge fan of this, how this shook out. It opened up a huge new world for me of the Wellington Fund, of inflation, of deflation, and of course the 80-20. Because don't forget, I still had the Wellington Fund with 5% a year out, but even during deflationary, it still ran out of money 28 years later, from 1930 to 1958. You still ran out of money. But if you had the 20% in government bonds on top of the Wellington Fund, you had literally 20% more than what you put in after taking out 5% a year just for inflation. Good stuff. We'll see you next time.